Welcome to this special from Windows on the World. It's a follow-up from last week where we talked about law and providence. And I did say at the end of that show, we'd be talking about the community activism, the taking down of people who go against a narrative. And that narrative is the narrative that goes along with the globalist objectives generally. So we're going to be talking about something which is in effect community terrorism. I have reported on this before. There is an article called Small Venues and Charities Under Attack. We're going to get into all that as we go along. But on a scale of 1 to 10, we could talk about it like this, in that, excuse me, I just could turn that down. Yes, talk about it in the respect that on the scale of 1 to 10, 1 could be ignoring your letters and having very bad interactions with people in your local council. Number 10 could be gang stalking. Yes, that does actually happen. Assault and even murder. And I can attest to the scale of 1 to 10 because I have actually witnessed and been around when this sort of community activism is in its full-on mode. So we're going to be talking about that. And the thing is about this is that most who have actually been attacked by the community terrorism model are too traumatized and absolutely bamboozled by what's happened to explain it clearly, because what happens is that they get attacked on multiple fronts at the same time. And those that have not experienced it can't believe it happens because it's alien to them. So therefore, people who suffer this and do get attacked look paranoid. Now, you may wonder what I'm actually talking about here, but it's all going to be explained as we go on. It's really about what happens when people go against an existing narrative. And that narrative is in every community. And that control of the community narrative is pretty much overall in the present time. When we started off talking about this around 2008, 2009, we then got into 2010 and Cameron's Big Society, Obama's Army in America, all revolving around this idea of community activism. And what's community activism? Well, community activism can be anything from Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil. It can be elderly people gluing themselves to roads. It's a form of theatre. It's there as a form of theatre, which is, in essence, just about trying to influence and control public opinion. On the other side of it, we have people who may have set up venues which are outside the community hubs narrative, which is the global goals of Agenda 2030. And anything outside of that, which may be individualistic, needs to be taken down for the common good. Of course, because as we said in last week's show, a lot of court cases are done around this idea of the common good. In other words, that if you are against the agenda in some way, or you're standing up and you are a self-employed person, or you represent a real part of a community that is really marginalized, not one that is manufactured, then you can be attacked from all sides. And this involves personal attacks online. It involves doxing. It involves threats against members of your family. And at the higher level, as I said when we opened this, even murder. And that sounds very drastic, and indeed it is drastic. So I'm just going to give you an overall view of the synopsis of this particular show. It's a look at the tactics of terror used by indoctrinated mercenary agents, often corporate-backed, in hostile takeovers of small venues. We also include case studies of violence, threats, vandalism and theft used by state-trained subversives, supported by corporate interests, government bodies, local councils and other interested parties, including, this is very important, property developers. So that's a very important thing, that we're talking about something corporate here, which means, of course, people get paid. So we're talking about paid activists. So we're not just really talking about open society and the influence of figures like George Soros on the democracy of other countries and many countries where NGOs are active. We're talking about even smaller micro level organizations and groups of people who are cells who are put there for a particular purpose. For instance, say you've got a little community center in your neighborhood and it's putting on a really wide variety of different activities, but it's outside the narrative and scope of control. For instance, when I was doing talks in the UK about what was going on, they were banned in most of the venues. But I wasn't saying anything really controversial. I was just giving information as to how a governing system works. So if you take that as an example and you pick up somebody who may be against the local council and is criticizing the council and is building an opposition, they most often will be attacked and defamed. And this happens all the time. We can actually compare this to on the global scale to what's just happened in Romania and what is now happening in Turkey, even though I don't know the details of that last event that's taking place because I'm not in the country. But when you look at this, it's a similar tactics. You get an opposition group that wants to take over and steer the narrative, and the people who are the victims will be defamed, and all of these other things that we've been talking about will and can happen to them. So yes, I think that's the most important thing about this is those targeted find it hard to explain as the attacks are on multiple fronts at once and so audacious the victim can't believe it's possible as it's outside their experience of how anything works. And that is the key. Once you know how this works, it's a template. And we've talked about it in many, many shows when we've talked about the impositions of what's happening on the global to local agenda. And remember what we said in last week's show, that under communitarian law, the innocent do not get accused. Therefore, if you're attacked by a group of community activists, you are assumed to be in the wrong, you are assumed to be guilty, even by the police. And this is where community policing comes in. As the show goes on, I'll explain more about this. But this is really like a little manual, if you like, of how to deal with this, how to spot it, and how it actually works, because there's nothing imaginative or different about this. It's a template that is the same all the time because it came out of this idea of the big society. It came out of communitarianism. It came out of the ideas of just a few people who steer governing principles in what are known as Western democracies. So yes, community terrorism, that's what we can call it. It can be for the state, against the state, and with the complicity of the state. And it can even be a false flag. You falsely blame an enemy for attacking you. This is the modus operandi of the change agents. In other words, they become the victim. So terror tactics are used by the community change agents. Not many people talk about this. We have people in America who've talked about it for quite a long time, but in the UK, pretty much all the media ignores it. But it's a very important thing because if people want to retain their sovereignty, then they need to know about this stuff. So, okay, we all know how local government shuts down opposition, say for the 20 miles per hour zones and the closing of the roads, and it demonizes those who expose their tactics. And even this fraudulent activity that goes on in councils, and even at the top end, criminality. And we know what happens to those sort of people. They're deemed to be far right, or they are personally attacked. It's always an ad hominem attack, an attack against the person. That goes into the Saul Alinsky rules for radicals, which were also part of the big society. We're going to get into that as we get along. Don't worry, I'm going to explain it all. So that's great. I think we're live and everybody's in the chat there. That's great. So the question is, have you been a victim? You may well have been a victim. When I found out how this worked and started putting information out, information came flooding in from all over Britain and interestingly across Europe. Somebody contacted me from Germany and said, I set up this community and it didn't make sense what had happened to me until I started listening to your shows. So that's what these shows are for, because when this happens to people, they think, is it me or is it the people around me? And this is what is part of this gaslighting and this personal, relentless attack on people who have been targeted. So violence or intimidation to achieve political or ideological aims, which is actually a definition of terrorism. So we're talking about domestic terrorism here. And of course, in communitarian law, only guilty people are accused. So there's not much leeway for what is known as justice in what is known as social justice. So let's have a look at some of the examples of how this is rolled out. Corporations use domestic terrorists, property developers use domestic terrorists, councils use agitators and people who are on the fringes of domestic terrorism. NGOs and government bodies also do this. Lobbying groups are particularly known for this. They will send down activists to disrupt events they do not like. They will openly get Antifa people to events that they do not deem to be part of their narrative. And as we know, Antifa is a terrorist organization. It's really just a front, and the people in it are useful idiots for an agenda. A little bit like the anarchist groups that used to spring up whenever there was a protest. The anarchists would turn up all dressed in black at the end. Of course, they were undercover police. They would spray an anarchy symbol on the wall, and people would get attacked, and it would get on the evening news. The evening news only needed that short video of half a dozen people attacking the police, and the job's done. The people are demonized, and everyone's far right, and the rest of the common good community can live happily ever after, if that's the right interpretation of it, which is the interpretation that, of course, they want. So yeah, it started with in 2010 with Cameron's Big Society. I'm going to read you something from a document which was submitted by a group called Unlimited, who train agents of change and social entrepreneurs. I'm not suggesting that they're involved in this, but what I'm saying is that on the lower scale of change, these people are very active. These people who were part of this Big Society launch, there was things like locality, intentionality. They had all these sort of names. And now they don't need those as much, because most of the plans that were going to be implemented have been implemented. In other words, the infrastructure is already there. People may want to complain about it, but there hasn't been enough organized resistance to actually change anything in most of the areas. And of course, the agent provocateurs and the people who infiltrate these groups, who are the opposition groups, and take them over, are the people we're talking about. But this is from an interesting document that was a parliamentary document, written evidence submitted, as I say, by Unlimited, March 2011. So it's quite a long time ago. The impact of reductions will be one of anger, the degree of which is yet to be realized. As the reality of reduced services hit, people will rise to action. The key to Big Society succeeding is to galvanize this energy. In other words, take it over, infiltrate and control the narrative. I'm going to give you now a quote from Demos, a public policy think tank, who actually are very influential with the British media and also with government. So they inform the UK press and TV, and they have direct links to the intelligence services in the UK. I know that because we actually did a debate with them about 12 years ago, and one of their main change agents actually said they were in direct contact and had instruction from MI5. So all of this is really about one agenda. Once people know that this is a template, and if you're outside it, you get attacked, it becomes a lot easier. And also, it's a lot simpler to deal with it. So this is the quote from Demos. The new democracy will work with a combination of government open infiltration and citizens groups taking direct action. Think about that. Government open infiltration, citizens groups taking direct action. So on the more banal level, we've got Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion was set up through the intelligence services by people who actually started a thing called Democracy Village to get the peace campaigner Brian Hoare and his partner, Barbara Tucker. They were there for years protesting the Iraq war. So these intelligence services set up a thing called Democracy Village, which was actually made up of people who'd taken over the Occupy movement. And one of those people is the managing director of the holding company of Extinction Rebellion. So this is really interesting. You can look at our articles on that. It's very, very detailed. And all of the information is in those articles on Extinction Rebellion at windowsontheworld.net. But that will give you an idea of how this works on the corporate level. So there's different levels of this. The activism level is one level, but a lot of the people who are recruited as activists then become these, what can only be described as community terrorists. So I wrote an article about 2014 called Big Society Change Agents. I'm going to put the links under this show when it's finished. But that was really about how the narrative is taken over locally. So loosely, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the two lies. So let's talk about the two lies. So what is termed the left, which is just a term and not relevant to manage. It's not relevant to how things are managed, will attack people and call them the right wing. So they will use this left and right, but in actual fact, there's a governing system that runs through it, which has nothing to do with the left or the right. That's very, very important when you're talking about the top end of this, because the top end of this is where it's really controlled from. So it's not these so-called grassroots movements, which of course aren't grassroots. Whenever you see grassroots, you know damn well that it is an infiltrated steering group to take over the narrative of public opinion. So yes, there's big society change agents, and in that we talk about the opposition groups, about infiltration, how things are taken over as community action groups. Very, very important this, because when you see the word community, you have to remember that it's an imposition from above that's not you. So the way around that, of course, is to form a community group and use the terminology of these people who are going to attack. So in other words, you absorb their terminology. And that's what they tried to do with a small venue that was taken over. They tried to imitate it by fraud and imply that they were the actual real owners of the property. The audacity is off the charts when it comes to this form of community terrorism. And it's supported especially by the community police. When something is reported to the police as a crime, say there's been an assault on the property, they might be trying to set fire to the property, they might have broken into the property, they might have stolen stuff from the property, they might have even tried to change the title deed on the land registry, then it often, and I would say mostly, will get put into community policing. Fraud is not taken seriously, especially in the UK, because they set up this organization called Action Fraud, and somebody went in there as a volunteer or an employee, and they were just throwing paper planes at each other. It was ridiculous. So I got onto Action Fraud about a real matter of fraud by impersonation of a company that had been taken over by radicals, and there was no reply. Yet when the radicals wrote to Action Fraud trying to demonize the real company, they were taken notice of. So this is something you have to be aware of, that there's one narrative going on. And we did a show called an article. It's article with many shows called The Big Society Unveiled. And it goes into the rules for radicals, the Saul Alinsky rules for radicals, which are used to this day and came out of the Cameron Big Society and the Obama Army of America. Obama openly stated they were going to use Saul Alinsky's rules, and that was also announced by Cameron in the UK. And through all of these community networks that was set up at the time. So all of those were listed in Big Society Change Agents. There was so many of them. One was actually called community organizers. What they do is they'll put elderly people at the front in, say they've got a community hub, they'll put these old people in there as volunteers, and they're a kind of human shield, if you like, because people say, oh, it's just a load of old people working and giving them something to do. This is proper community. But behind that are the people steering them. And behind them are groups who actually call themselves dragons, who are there to attack members of the public who may find out what's really going on. How do I know this? I've had experience of it through the years. Extinction Rebellion had people called dragons. Occupy had people called dragons. And it's actually in their documentation. we had the documentation, which was from Extinction Rebellion, because the person who was doing the Extinction Rebellion website actually was not happy with him, and he left a lot of stuff public that was not meant to be. So we got a list of every single person who was an activist, who was a paid activist for Extinction Rebellion. And guess what? They were the paid activists who disrupted Occupy. They were the paid activists from the Democracy Village, all of these previous government-backed agitation groups. So if you want to know more about that, there is a show called Truthers Don't Get Fooled Again. Truthers Don't Get Fooled Again. I went through that with a friend of mine from years ago, and we both had much experience of observing and really looking at the template, which is still going on. There is nothing imaginative or new. And yes, absolutely. So in what is now known as your community and under the banner of the big society, change agents are implementing social change. They will not tell you directly what the change is. That is from the Big Society Unveiled. Actually, the show that accompanies that is over 10 years old. 10 years old. And we were well into the agenda even then, because I'd done many, many shows on it. But no one talks about this. So that's why I'm putting this information out, just for those who need it. Because interestingly, when I do put shows out like this, which have the most important and intense and serious information in, I often get people unsubscribing. That's a good thing, because I don't want those sort of people listening. So then basically, when they won't tell you what the change is, the reason is that they are implementing change that most people don't want. The change is loss of all individual rights over collective consensus, which means everyone agrees as they have no choice. That's a quote from that article and series of shows, The Big Society Unveiled. So there's another show called Know the Enemy Within, and that's got many links also. And there's another one called Agents of Revolution. And that was a follow-up to COVID protest social engineers, because, of course, those so-called protests were steered into the inevitable outcome, which is the cul-de-sac, where protest gets steered into. If protest is of no use as a driver of change in the global agenda, then it's led into a cul-de-sac or just destroyed. So that's why you have to set up your own groups, your own local groups, and keep them under the radar until you're ready to act. And that's what I find interesting about this. It's like a game. They've set it up like a game, and the game is very well established, but the game never changes. And people will still get steered into the same two lies, the left or the right, and they will still keep supporting the same puppets that they're given. They will still get led by the people who shout the loudest, who seem to be the next hero on the block, who then, out of the blue, just disappear. And then another one turns up and they follow that one. So once you've seen this for 15, 20 years, you know that there's a definite template in place. So yes, I'm going to give you a quote now. The radical revolutionary groups which control all opposition to globalism are run by the Revolutionary by Numbers School of Direct Action, organized and funded template protest. That is from Agents of Revolution. Do take a look at that. The article I'm going to be talking about is Small Charities and Venues Under Threat. And this was a real story that happened. I was part of this story because Windows on the World was actually given room in this building that was attacked. And the lady who was running this small charity and this real community venue is now dead. And she actually did say at one point that if I die, it's them that's killed me. And in actual fact, it was the stress, which she never got over, which I think did kill her, because she died about 18 months ago. And this is as serious as it gets, really, isn't it? So I'll just give you a little snippet from that article, which is called Small Charities and Venues Under Threat. The lady who is the target of all this, along with myself and trustees, has put her life savings into keeping the building open and is absolutely traumatized by the ceaseless intimidation, has a serious heart condition, and she sent me this message recently. They have sent mail to my son's address and say they are coming down to attack him and me. They have posted on social media that there is a warrant out for my arrest. Of course, there wasn't. I have not stolen anything. In fact, my own money has been holding up the building for the last 12 years. If I have a stroke or heart attack, I want it known that they have murdered me. So this was exactly what she said. And it was only because I had knowledge of how this worked. I was contacted around 2009 to 2010 by people up and down the country who had seen local community centres being taken over and people put into their community and taking over everything from the local farmers market to the village parish hall. And a lot of people couldn't understand why this was happening. People were arriving, it seemed, overnight. They were setting up community groups. They were pushing all the sustainable development goals and the goals that are not popular with most people, the restriction of transport and the controlling of all local narratives. Let's just keep it simple and say that. And it went from really weird things like people saying, oh, they've smashed up my greenhouse because I stood up in this council meeting, or I complained about what they're doing at the local village hall, or I'm actually following this subversive drama that they're putting on. And this happened in South Wales. I did cover it at the time. It was very, very disturbing. And then when I started to put the picture together, we found, guess what? The LinkedIn army. You know, LinkedIn. That is how they were all communicating. They were all on there, all of these change agents, all of these people for social change. Now, people who are uninformed will call these Marxists. They're not Marxists. A lot of them will go along with some of the fundamentals of Marxism, but this invites intellectual debate. So we do need to delineate here the difference between Marxists and communitarians, because this is where they will get into a kind of Jordan Peterson word salad nonsense, which is there to derail you. And you have to avoid that, because then they will get into ideology. I had this years ago when I called him the big green ego. And funnily enough, when I was looking up Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, he had done a short version of the book. So the indoctrination here is off the charts. But what they will do is they will say, oh, yes, Saul Alinsky's techniques could have been misunderstood or misused. And they go on about what he was trying to achieve for poor people. Well, the way that they use now, these rules for radicals, these rules of attacking people, are nothing to do with that. They're just to do with management. So this is where you have to be really careful. Do not get drawn into ideological arguments. This is just a management system. There's nothing else to it. It's just about management and controlling of all narratives. So that's very, very important now. But yes, we found them all on LinkedIn. And I had this contact who was sending me all this stuff. Very sinister. Some of these people were subversive and very unhinged. And that led into research into areas which are quite dangerous to go into, in that we're talking about murders and people who were taken out and people who actually disappeared. So, as I say, there's a scale of 1 to 10. And you'll find them in your local council, those belligerent trained agents of change who will not answer your questions, then make accusations and then cut you off. This is why Alinsky actually said that you personalize and polarize the target, because you make the person the victim, the attack, the subject of the attack. You make a person liable, which is actually quite good advice if you're talking about a public official, because they are meant to be publicly liable. But I had a lot of fun with all this as well. It's not just something that's really intimidating and scary. So there is a lot of fun you can have. And I brought down websites. I brought down websites in Waltham Forest when I was there that were accusing people in a communitarian manner of crimes which they hadn't committed. And I asked who indemnified the person to put up people's photographs who hadn't been to court. And the next day, the website disappeared. It'd gone. So this is the thing about the audacity, is that It's just audacity. There's not much behind it, really. And these people do run a mile if you use the right tactics. And we are talking about a kind of warfare here because it affects your daily life. This is the point. It will affect how you live, how you can maybe hold on to your property, because that's obviously a agenda to take the property, your right to travel, which is a fundamental right. All these the global mafia want to take away, and they have millions of agents, and this is just the front end of it that you will get engaged with. So yes, there's corrupt officials, community dupes, people who believe in the globalist agendas, who are recruited in the building of a movement for financial and political gain. The university system, a great training ground for these subversives, and that is the training ground for the people who attacked my friend's small charity venue. Now, this venue had everything going on there. They had like punk rock weekends. They had a very famous Iranian singer who said that all the venues in Britain are corporate. I want to use this venue. And he had about 28 million followers. So we're talking about a venue here that is diverse in the real sense, not diverse in that everything has to be the same and monitored by the agents. So yes, we look about Cambridge University a couple of years ago, because I found that these subversives that attacked a small charity were Cambridge educated. One had been to Princeton as well. But it's interesting because when we remember the recruited spies for the Soviet Union in the 1930s, they came from Cambridge University. Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross. They were the most infamous spy ring of the 20th century. So Putin would, of course, now be the enemy of the change agents, and they would be globalist change agents, which is what they are now. And I was talking to somebody who actually went to Cambridge University, said it's really weird because without any prompting, I'd never mentioned this before. He said, there's all these people I know or knew who went through Cambridge University, and they're now working for these NGOs, and they're getting hundreds of thousands of pounds a year for lobbying for these globalist NGOs. And he said he'd never seen anything like it because they weren't going into jobs where they could progress. They were going in and getting a huge wage. So this is a field where money is no object. With the global goals, money, of course, is no object because it's all filtering down from the World Bank. So thousands are being trained and have been since 2010. And it did start with a lot of these organizations who were training people to be social entrepreneurs. And this is where we have to delineate, because this word social entrepreneur, it's worth bearing in mind. They don't bandy it around as much as they used to, but basically to be part of these organizations or trained by them, you're trained into these principles. So the people may not be aware of what they're even doing. So some of these change agents aren't even aware that they are change agents, but many are. And the ones that you'll see at the top of local government definitely are. So yes, subversives trained at Oxford and Cambridge working for NGOs and or activist groups using the Saul Alinsky rules for radicals. So this is interesting because Barack Obama used the ideas on his path to the US presidency. Made a few notes here. Hillary Clinton wrote her thesis on Saul Alinsky. And grassroots movements from both the left and now the right treat his work as the template for action. So if they're using this as a template, then you can use it too. So there's two sides working at the top level for one unified globalist aim. So let's forget the left and right nonsense. The 1971 book Rules for Radicals. Now let's look at the basic philosophy. Was talking about giving the power to the have-nots and taking it away from the haves. Well, again, you see, that's quite muddy, because what Alinsky was doing was he was empowering certain groups to take actions and attack people within corporations and government. And then there was other people who followed on with this, and this is why it's so interesting, because now what we've got is just this template for the communitarian society which controls everything locally, or believes it does. So it has nothing now to do, of course, with the underprivileged. It's actually the privileged who use the rules for radicals, as they are supported by the state agents in all levels of governance. So let's have a look now at Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals, and you can find them in the articles that I've put up. And do have a look at Agents of Revolution and the Communitarian Agenda Explained. Those are very useful also. So number one is, power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. I'll think about that. Power is not what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. In other words, audacity and authority, assumed authority, is how they do this. So they'll come in as though they're an authority on something and say, you're doing this wrong, you're breaking the law. They usually don't know what they're talking about. In fact, the people who attacked my friend's charity definitely didn't know what they were talking about, but they were supported not only by the police, but to a certain extent through the courts. But you can still win against them. Okay, number two is, never go outside the expertise of your people. The result is confusion, fear, and retreat. So you have to give very simple instructions and have simple goals. So if you wanted to use this idea, you would have an objective, a very simple objective. And when that objective had been reached, you would have another objective. In other words, you do not confuse people with too many things, and you use people and their skills. So people who are really good at something, they like doing that. So use them for that. You might get people who are really good at administration. I was pretty good at writing letters and scaring these people off. And I got great joy out of it because they needed to be taken down a peg. It's called balance. This is about balancing the books, remember. This isn't about a kind of pitch warfare or reacting against something. What we're talking about here is balancing the books against people who are radically subversive and do not have your own interests at heart, to say the least. So three is, whenever possible, go outside the expertise of the enemy. Again, this ties into the audacity and the assumption. So they will make assumptions like they did on my friend's charity about this charity and what its objectives were and what its community aims were. They didn't get that right at all. For instance, they said none of the trustees live in the borough. There was nothing in the constitution that said trustees had to live in the borough, and mostly they hadn't. So you can often catch them out in their own framework. And that's what Alinsky's actually saying here. Four, make the enemy live up to its own book of rules. That's really important with any public official. Hold them strictly to account. Hold the people who are attacking your organization or your belief system, make them live up to their own rules. Alinsky gave this example that many people call themselves Christians and go into a church, but they don't live up to those principles. So another very useful thing here I found was that if you live up to really high standards and principles, you seem to get some kind of assistance here. That's what's said about Providence last week. And Providence played a massive part in overthrowing these people because they had property developers behind them, they had the council behind them, they had the community police behind them, and they even had the bailiff company behind them. Because at a top level, a lot of stuff's done behind the scenes. So this is why people think this stuff can't happen. They can't see that there is multi-agency complicity in the takeover and the ruining of people who go against the global to local agenda. So make the enemy live up to its own book of rules. Really, really good. That's how I got that website taken down. It was called Busters. They had put a picture of a Polish woman who didn't give her address to a private security company. And they said, we have a fine for this woman. Well, they can't say that because it didn't go to court. And they can't say that because they didn't have factual evidence of of what they would put it on their hearsay. So I got onto them. I said, who wrote this website? Who wrote this? And who wrote we have a fine for this person, we want you to find her? That's basically stalking, right? So I got put onto this fella. I've played it on the shows years ago, and he was full of it, full of audacity. Well, of course, she's committed an offence, and we can do this, and I can do that, and I can do this, and I can do that. Well, just because you're in a well-paid job and you're insulated with an office does not mean you're invulnerable. So I said, who indemnifies you to put pictures of people up there that haven't been charged with any offence? And he says, well, I can do this, well, I can do that, and I'm going to terminate the conversation. Interestingly, he's obviously gone to a high up. Next day, website gone. Twitter feed gone. The website had been removed, taken down. So I did the same thing with Crime Stoppers. That's another story. But it goes to show you that make the enemy live up to its own book of rules actually works. So this is going to be used against you, so use it back. So 5 is ridicule is a man's most potent weapon. Interestingly, the people who are spouting this stuff from what they term the left have no sense of humor whatsoever. So that one's been completely left out. They don't use ridicule. They use sarcasm, which is not the same as ridicule. Ridicule is making everyone laugh at them. And they hate that. When I got the council into court after what I was talking about last week about that single person discount validation form, I ridiculed them. I ridiculed them online afterwards. And that is what they hate, because they take themselves really seriously. If you don't take yourself too seriously, that's another great tactic for, guess what? Winning. Yes, ridicule is a man's most potent weapon. Now, they don't use that one, so that's a great one to use. So what Alinsky said was, it is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. True, right? Also, it infuriates the opposition, who then react to your advantage. That's so true, because part of the Alinsky rules, which we're going to get onto, is that they attack people online, or they'll come up to you and try and provoke you into hitting them. That is provocation to get you to attack them, because they want you to attack. So the way around it, of course, is not to attack, but ridicule does work. Ridicule does work. I remember I was in a court case for the charity, and they sent round someone to the court who was shouting in the court all day, who was high on something, probably crack cocaine, which they'd given him. And they'd recruited this person because he was a drug addict. They do that. They recruit a lot of people who have drink, drug, and mental health problems. The intelligence community do that a lot. But what really happened was, I started to ridicule these middle class, fake lefty, Marxists, whatever the popular term is, just call them change agents. And they couldn't deal with that, because they thought they were part of the community. They thought they were standing up for marginalized people, as per Saul Alinsky. Well, they were the privileged ones. They were the ones who had privilege. They were the ones to be ridiculed, because they were the outsiders. And because we ridiculed them, and because they kind of exposed themselves, the people, they were trying to start a revolution, a real revolution. They were trying to start riots in a place which was notorious for riots. It was very dangerous what they were doing. And one of the reasons the police were very cautious, to say the least, at first, is because of this. They were very scared of another riot situation breaking out. But these middle class, Cambridge educated agents were trying to use one group, a local group, to attack another local group for their benefit. And it doesn't always work. So number 6 is, a good tactic is one your people enjoy. If your people are not having a ball doing it, there is something very wrong with the tactic, basically. So you have to have something that hooks people in, that gets them wanting to do it. Because if you're under attack and you're going nowhere, and I've seen that recently, people have been standing up for someone who has been sent to prison, and the state are attacking them. the state of sending agent provocateurs, and these people are violent. They will use violent criminals. They'll use people who have been released from prison, and or maybe they get an early release, or they've got crimes that have been taken into consideration, saying, well, look, if you do a bit of work for us. And this is not unusual, by the way, because this is how the police were recruiting climate activists as spies years ago. So when we look at this, it's one template. It doesn't matter whether it's Extinction Rebellion or a local group who are basically committing what can be loosely described and accurately described as terrorism. It's the same objectives. There is an ongoing plan that is being worked towards. So if you have an ongoing plan and a plan to counteract what's going on, you have to have a plan, and then you can stick to it. And that's all these people do. But what I'm saying is they're very, very easy to interrupt. And another thing that Alinsky says is number 7. This is number 7 in the rules for radicals. A tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. So that's really important. You have to keep changing tack. And what I said to people who were under attack online and being defamed by these gang stalking groups was that once they've thrown everything, they've got nothing else to throw. So once they've defamed you, made things up about you and lied, and you don't react, often it just disappears, because in social media and in the places where they post these things, the attention span is very short. So that is very true what Alinsky says there. And it was quite prophetic when you think about it. A tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag, especially now, because attention spans are nowhere. Very important. So yes, what he says under this was, man can sustain militant interest in any issue only for a limited time. So in other words, if hate's being directed against somebody, then that can be that can get counteracted. People might feel sympathy for that person. And Alinsky also takes that into account, in that a positive can become a negative and a negative can become a positive. You have to be aware of that. So after this time, it becomes a ritualistic commitment, in other words. So it's a ritual of daily defamation. And he calls it like going to church on Sunday mornings, probably because he dedicated his first book, Rules for Radicals, to Lucifer. You see, he dedicated to the first rebel, Lucifer. So I'm just going to read something else here. New issues and crises are always developing, and one's reaction becomes, well, my heart bleeds for those people and I'm all for the boycott, but after all, there are other important things in life, and life goes on. And there you have it. So in other words, if they attack too much on one level, then people move on from it. They'll move on to something else. So that's worth knowing. So if you're getting attacked online, hold tight, don't get involved. It'll go away. And then you can counteract. Then you can come out. Once you are holding the cards, if you've done your research about these people, then you hold a weapon, which is very useful in counteracting them, because often these people will just disappear. They will just disappear off the face of the earth. And then they'll reappear several years later somewhere else. Happens a lot. So number 8 is keep the pressure on and never let up. Goes back to what I was just saying. Use different tactics and actions and utilize all events of the period for your own purpose. Having a purpose is so important, because a lot of people, when they're protesting against something, they're already led into this idea that they're going to lose on a subconscious level. They might not believe that on the conscious level, but on the subconscious level, they're going, we're going to lose. But when this happened to my friend, because I'd been through many of these situations before, we shook hands on it. I said, we won't let them win. And we didn't, and they lost. So if 2 or 3 people maximum, with 2 of us really, but me just doing the interaction and the court paperwork and going to see the High Court, then it means that you have a very cohesive little unbreakable cell there, 2 to 3 people. But if you've got a larger group that can be infiltrated, and that happened. For instance, when we went to the building, I took someone along who was meant to be on our side. When he got into the building, he joined their side. You see, this is why you have to really know what you're doing. So yes, this is a important one, number 9. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. So people, if they're defamed or attacked or someone comes to their door, remember that this is a threat. This is just a threat. So 9 times, well, most times, I would say, I'd say more than 9 times out of 10, if someone threatens you, they don't mean it. And people who do mean it will not threaten you. That's very, very important. So if you get all these people online threatening people, and then of course you've got this thing on Twitter. I've had death threats on Twitter. Well, nobody's going to do you in if they're just saying something on Twitter. So this has to be gotten into perspective, and it's very tempting to react because you get so angry about it. But what you've got to remember is it's a game. This is a game that they're playing. They are deliberately wanting a reaction out of you, because once you react, and a lot of people this happens to, they react, they all of a sudden they blow their top, and people they're trying to explain it to think, oh, they're paranoid, they've gone mad, they're mentally unstable. That's called the destabilization, you see. They destabilize the victim by the constant attacks. And if you're not destabilized by that, as Alinsky himself says, it can't last long enough to have any effect. So that's very important. Number 10 is the major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. Now, that is the most important thing that they do. What I experienced was constant 24-hour attacks online and intimidation of people that I knew. And these people had access to information that they shouldn't have had access to. Information maybe only a private detective could get access to. And that's the very disturbing thing. For instance, a subversive turning up on a doorstep of someone 200 miles away from the venue and saying there was a hit out on the family. And the police, knowing who this was, because they found them on Facebook, they identified them, nobody was arrested. And remember, I wrote to the chief constable of the Metropolitan Police. It got put into local police, then it got put into community policing, which is where they bury it. And at one point the community police says, well, why don't your little charity give the building to them? It's only a building. Can you see the communitarian law in that the community is always in the right? So the pressure group that is seen to be part of the global to local agenda is always going to be perceived to be in the right. There are very few people in any public facing organization who will side with you. For instance, I wrote to the Baroness, who was the agent in charge of the Charity Commission, outlining the death threats, outlining everything that had happened. And it's a very long story. Do have a look at small charities and venues under attack. It'll blow your mind what's in there. All the court documents are in there. I don't want to go through them all because it's going to lose people, because this is the other Saul Alinsky thing. They throw so much at you in such a way, you can't believe that it's possible for all this to happen at once. And what they would do was they would do a really big attack on Friday night, because you can't get in touch with anyone till Monday then, because the lawyers aren't working, the police are hard to get hold of, the community police especially are only there about once a week. So when we found out that the crimes, the £40,000 worth of stuff that was taken, the people who had been threatened, the crimes that had been committed over a period of 2 to 3 years were all going to get put into community police. And when the community police person turned up and said no one's going to be arrested, we said, well, look at all of the crime references. We've got video of these people entering the building and vandalizing it, breaking up the wheelchair access place outside, all sorts of things, stealing the vehicles from outside. The police station was less than 200 yards away. They did nothing. And even the solicitors, the very good charity solicitors, actually said, we need all these things resolved. Was anything resolved? Never. Interestingly, this group of solicitors says, We've seen this before. We've seen this before, and it's a template. So even the solicitors had seen it before. So they've seen the Saul-Alinsky rules, you see. Okay, so number 11 is if you push a negative hard and deep enough, it will break through into its counter side, the positive. This is based on the principle that every positive has a negative and every negative has a positive. And that's the interesting thing, because the breaking through of the positive in this case was that local people started to see through what these people were doing. These people weren't from the area. They recruited people who were radical within the area, but they weren't embedded properly into the real community. So they were acting on behalf of the community, and many people going, well, wait a minute, they're not speaking for us. And maybe that lady was doing something right. And that's when the negative broke into a positive. But in the meantime, things will get worse or appear or seem to get worse. But there is a time limit on all this stuff. It's very interesting. So yes, 12, the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. Keep changing the goalposts, basically. And that is very, very important. That's what they do. That's what you must do. It says underneath it, you cannot risk being trapped by the enemy in his sudden agreement with your demand and saying you're right. You see, that's no good, because there has to be friction. There has to be opposition. So they have to make the attacks quite ludicrous and incredibly audacious. And so they exaggerate, very, very exaggerated attacks on people. So yes, number 13 is pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. That's when you get the personal attack. So what they'll do is they'll find the person who is most influential within a group, who's leading that group or is in charge of the association or organization, and relentlessly and mercilessly attack them, their family, and anyone connected to them. That's the most important thing. So once you know it's a template, you go, oh, I know what they're doing. And that removes any possible fear that you might have for it. Then you see it's a game. This is being played out just like a computer game. Once you know the algorithm of what they're doing, then you know when to respond. It's merely like a form of simplified chess. And it is very simple. It's very simple what they do. So yes, what happens when these rules are used against people for state-sponsored gain or gain financially by the privileged, presenting themselves as the underprivileged? Well, I think we've just explained that. I do like to have notes as I go along to stay on track. So what if you are outside the community narrative and the approved community hub? Well, you can become a victim of so-called community organizing, also known in 2010 as the Big Society, the Saul-Alinsky rules, and the communitarian system, which is never talked about. So where the so-called far left is a corporate-backed globalist agenda who attack the so-called far right, who are the enemy. Both these terms are meaningless and used as a smokescreen and used for covering the corporate takeover of venues, the malicious attacking of someone perceived to be in the way, or the theft of property. Remember, property developers are involved in the recruiting of these activists. Being defined as far right is one of the main tactics of the communitarians, of course. Anybody listening to this would know that. And of course, there is no far right. It's invisible and it's not definable. So we're talking about management here. We're talking about name slinging to cover up the real versus the stated goals. So they then use race and identity politics. And often this is very, very unsuccessful, as was in the cases that I dealt with. They threaten to start revolutions. They try and wind up the useful idiots against police or against local community so that the property or the organization is taken over or surrendered. So using what appear to be different and opposing groups to hide the true agenda and the culprits. So you may get groups that seem to be against the attackers, but they're all working together. It's the same as a bailiff company putting a website up of how to deal with bailiffs. You see what I mean? That's what happened when I put my article up years ago with the JBW group one. Highway robbery, don't pay them because their accounting was proved not to be accurate. So don't pay them. And I was suggesting people do other things direct action things for themselves. And of course, they tried to get lawyers against me and that sort of thing. Didn't work. But as a response to any possible uh, alternative view coming in, they then try and control the narrative by saying, well, we're the bailiffs, but let's set up a company pretending to be against us. It's just so obvious. It's childish, really, when you think about it. But do have a look at Agents of Revolution. I'll put the links up later. So the revolutionary spirit is accounted for. The revolutionary spirit is harnessed and steered. The radical revolutionary groups which control all opposition to globalism are run by the Revolutionary by Numbers School of Direct Action. That's a quote from that actual article. Organized and funded template protests. Remember, it's always a template. These people have no imagination. They can't think outside the box. So in a way, they don't use the Saul Alinsky rules properly because they don't change their tactics at all. The globalist-backed anti-globalists work for all globalist goals, whether it's the direct action pantomime of useful idiots gluing themselves to roads, throwing super paintings, or disrupting council public meetings. That we covered that in The Solution, which is a show I did all about how the narrative is controlled locally. And these actions are theatre, nothing more. Nothing comes of them. It's just theatre. They are, however, backed by change agents in all areas of controlled dissent. They prevent all useful opposition. Very important point, that, because if you're involved in these organised and steered groups, then you're going nowhere, or worse. They use sound bites, slogans, and billboards given to them by those they appear to oppose. Those that appear to oppose the Soros-backed revolutionary groups are steered in exactly the same way. All moods are catered for. The system of controlled opposition is very thorough in selecting its chosen sound bites and allowed dissent. Direct action theatre includes hijacking public meetings and appealing to those in the room who oppose the impositions, such as low traffic neighbourhoods. The effective way of dealing with this issue is then removed, and those implementing it without consultation have further excuses not to interact with the public. It gives those who could have had or held or made public officials accountable, let's say, an easy way out. They can shut down public meetings, disappear from public view until after the restrictions have been implemented. How many times have I seen that before? The radical soundbite trained neo-Marxists are the frontline tools of the globalists. There are those that understand this and the vast majority that do not. I'm just quoting from this article. Interestingly, the inner hardcore of hardline agitators within these subversive direct action groups are known as dragons. These target anyone who they see as a threat and use terrorist tactics. They are supported even by the police, sometimes arrested and de-arrested to make them look more legitimate. Dragons are used in all protest groups and were used to divide and rule in Occupy, and are part of the inner core of globalist-backed anti-globalist groups such as Extinction Rebellion. Yes, I have the emails to prove it. The distraction principle means that the steered groups are always ready for their next time-wasting exercise. The world revolutionary movement captures the directionless and disables those who believe they have direction. It only takes one loudmouth direct action actor to steer a large group. The protest groups all have agents and dragons assigned to them. If you are planning something, stay off the radar of public groups. All this has been covered in our shows along with the tactics used. So I like to read out some of this stuff because each line is very important and you can listen back to these and it kind of sinks in, makes it easier, I think. Yes, solutions are the enemy of the world revolutionary movement and their drone armies. So now we get on to this small charity, and I'm going to give you a quote from the article and some of the stuff that we got from the lawyers and give you a bit of an idea of a template of how an organization can be taken over. For the last 12 months, the trustees and their chair, a lady who ran a successful community venue in London, have been the victims of a vicious hate campaign by two well-funded individuals who have libeled, incited hatred, made false reports to the police and accused the trustees of fraud, even making false representations in both the county and the High Court. Interesting that one of these people was training to be a lawyer, yet went to the Royal Courts of Justice and perjured themselves in front of a judge. That's a very serious offence, to perjure oneself in chambers in front of a judge. But they did it. And as far as I know, They got away with it. These individuals set up websites, distributed leaflets, contacted press, and falsely accused the trustees of all manner of crimes. Interestingly, there is a network of online magazines that masquerade as things like business information or local news, yet they are part of these subversive networks. When I looked at who owned them, I wasn't surprised, but most people would be surprised at the scale and the way these people are linked. Remember what I said earlier, they all use LinkedIn. Everything's in public. We found all the people that were subverting local so-called democracy on LinkedIn. And then I found people who had not taken everything down off the internet. And one of them was incredibly disturbing. It was a change agent who had appeared overnight round the Somerset, Dorset area, appeared overnight, was all over Google, had been to all of these openings, etc., and had posted photographs, including one that was a child's wrist being slashed over a sink, saying, teaching a lesson to the children. And she was working with children. So this was about 2010 when I started to find out that these people were linked to some very high crime agendas. Let's call it agendas. We're talking about people who could be taken out. We're talking about people who could have been suicided. Very, very serious stuff. So, yes, the group submitted plans on the building fraudulently to the council using the name of the owners. Can you believe that? The council were informed of the fraud, yet failed to take this down from the website that they'd uploaded it to. Another thing that happened was the leader of the council was in touch with the trespassers who'd taken over the building. Remember, this was a working building that was taken over. They broke into it and they then held events in there. And the licenses were requested to be taken off the building because it was no longer safe. So they were holding events in there and charging people money under the name of the actual charity, impersonating it by fraud. Nobody would do anything about that. So, yes, and the person who was the target had put their life savings into keeping the building open and was traumatized by the ceaseless intimidation, eventually died through the shock of what happened several years later. But she never got over what happened. So, yes, the police knew the suspects but did nothing. The leader of the council was in communication with the trespassers. Those fraudulently using the trust name had an office in a council business enterprise centre. So here we see the global to local agenda. So we have what are in effect community terrorists embedded and in complicit action with local council officials. And people will say, I don't believe that. Well, I have the proof. It's happened, not just to me. It was happening all over the country from around 2010 onwards. So this was from the lawyers of the charity, and this was a press release that was put out. The legitimate tenants of the building have been threatened and ordered to pay money to these individuals who on the 29th of March, I think you can go into the article, Small Venues and Charities Under Attack, broke into the working charity building. They have so far stolen £20,000 of trust and personal trustees' property. Also, they stole up to £50,000 of printing equipment of one of the people who stood by the charity, who was renting some downstairs of the premises for his real community printing stuff. He had everything stolen. And this group stole the trust paperwork when they broke into the building and used the stolen personal information to harass friends and relatives of the trustees. They have sent hundreds of complaints to organisations to destroy the trust and stolen much property from the building, including the owner's vehicles. There have been numerous threats made by telephone, all recorded with the police under the Malicious Communications Act. The police have at all times failed to act. The matter was raised with the Borough Commander of the Metropolitan Police and given to the Haringey Borough Commander, who passed it on to part-time community policing. And that was where the action stopped, because the woman who was brought in said, I'm only going to be here once every 2 weeks. So we could no longer go to the police. And the first thing this woman said was, no one's going to get arrested. She later said, why don't you give the building to them? It's only a building. Communitarianism. That's when the mob are in charge, and the mob are the community. There have been no arrests despite the police knowing the perpetrators of the crimes and the suspects. The community police buried all the crime reports and failed to act on any of the evidence. Personal details have been published next to slanderous lies about the trustees. The ringleaders are extorting money from the public with fake fundraising events. The two ringleaders also uploaded doctored audio files to their website of recorded conversations in their attempts to libel trustees. So they even had access to trustee meetings. There was somebody within the trust meetings that was been allowed in that was recording them, doctoring those recordings to make it look as though there was underhand business going on, when of course there wasn't. The solicitor's statement now. Summary. The illegal occupation of the premises was finally brought to an end in January 2020 after further county court applications for renewed writ of possession. I went to the High Court, went to see a master, because the people who had been told to leave the premises actually got a stay of execution. They perjured themselves in front of a High Court judge in chambers. I went down to the Royal Courts of Justice, got that ruling overturned. I got that ruling overturned, and they asked me if I had a writ, and we said, yes, we've still got a writ. It turned out that the bailiff company seemed to have been in collusion with some people high up. Some people may say Freemasonry, maybe it's just the communitarian big society. And that meant that we had to go back to the court, and that's what this writ of possession was for. I simply said to the judge on a piece of paper, on our court documentation, the trust requires immediate possession of property and trespassers removed by order of the court, because previously they had said they had a right to be in the building. All the judge then had to do is said, all rights, implied or otherwise, that you may have had a contract for are from now rescinded. They are over. And they tried to argue their case for about 20 minutes, but it was going nowhere. So after that, they went down to the Royal Courts of Justice and they got a stay. There was actually a funeral there was a local funeral, and the police said, you should let the funeral go ahead. This gave the subversives a chance to retake the property. And the solicitors said, you need to really think about transferring this property now, because we think they're going to burn it down. So getting back to this, they said 2 years of ongoing personal threats, physical assault, unfounded and publicly broadcast allegations of wrongdoings have taken a severe toll on the lives, homes, families and livelihoods of unpaid voluntary trustees, past and present. Remember that I was part of this. We were all volunteers. Nobody was paying us to do anything, yet the people who were attacking us were getting paid. And we did in the end find out the most likely source of that money. The solicitors then go on to say, at time of writing, repeated unsupported legal challenges by the occupiers of the charity trust building have all been defeated at county and high court, but at huge cost to the charity and thus its beneficiaries. Following thorough review and guidance in person by officers of the Charity Commission, as well as ongoing advice, a renowned firm of specialist solicitors, the charity is now urgently required to progress the following: a police follow-up investigation into the reported, documented breaking, entering and theft of now £40,000 worth of professional printing equipment from the property secured in the basement and taken by the illegal occupiers, a review and reissue of the business rates currently being sought through High Court insolvency proceedings against voluntary registered holding trustees of the charity. Now, that was interesting because the charity had an 80% rates discount. Coinciding with all of the Saul-Alinsky rules, they then took that away and refused to reinstate it. So that's the solicitors saying, we're going to get that reinstated for you. This is afterwards. The solicitors got it reinstated because it was completely illegal what the council had done. So we're talking about council complicity. And of course, that's where we say all the power is in that local council. We've been saying that for a very long time. So resumption of full collaboration with the London Borough Council departments responsible for urban regeneration and planning for the wider benefit of the Haringey community, review of statutory responsibilities of the council for enforcement of licensing conditions as repeatedly requested. So yes, there was no licenses on the building. We'd taken the licenses off, but the council didn't take them off their website for weeks and weeks. Next point, consideration of actions to be considered in the light of individuals advertising via the Haringey Services website and or premises for rental to public and community bodies of licensed premises, basically to which Haringey, it was that borough, inspectors had been denied access. So the council were letting events go on in an illegal building where everything was dangerous in there. The electrics were dangerous. They would strip the building and it wasn't safe to be in, yet their inspectors had been denied access. So the council would not take the licenses off the building, and their inspectors had been denied access by the occupants, yet they were still allowed to stay in there and put on events, even after the court had ruled that they were merely trespassers and it was illegal. Documented misrepresentation to council and to Edmonton County Court of individuals claiming to be appointed trustees of a UK registered charity. That's what they did. They called themselves the steering committee of the charity, and they invited the real trustees to a meeting in front of their community in the building to explain themselves, to explain all these false crimes that they were meant to have committed. This is the audacity. This is the Saul Alinsky rules, 1,000%. But it failed. That was the good thing. It failed. So that's what they were doing. Yes, in order to gain right of possession of freehold property. Reporting to the Charity Commission that the charity is bound to provide all necessary help to the London Borough of Haringey and all other authorities to achieve a positive outcome for the Haringey community. So if the small venue had not had very good charity solicitors, remember the Charity Commission weren't on the side of the charity at all, because this was an old trust, you see, and it owned a lot of the council buildings which had been taken. And this is very contentious stuff because it owned a lot of buildings which the council had used for its own public buildings. So yes, no police action was taken against the subversives, who were supported by all state organisations, yet we still won, but at huge cost and at the cost of someone's life. So that's how serious it is. So you can see what I wrote to the Metropolitan Police Borough Commander, their responses, and the response of the head of the Charity Commission, who I contacted at her parliamentary office, who never responded, which is pretty disgraceful, I think. So the solutions really are, when this happens, and if this happens to you, do not respond. Put out one public notice, which is your own template. So basically, you get together a little template. What we did was we put up a notice for the people who used the building, said that the people who were in the building had nothing to do with it. They were impersonating the charity by fraud, and people entered at their own risk. And we then put down a few of the points and rebutted what they said. Do not rebut all of their points, because of the Saul Alinsky stuff. They keep throwing stuff. What they'll do is they'll keep throwing things at you that you feel duty bound to rebut. Don't feel duty bound to rebut any of it, because it will get forgotten about. Hit the main points and then attack them where you find out the information leads you into who they are. So yeah, never get drawn into dialogue online. Their agents will be there to attack. They will have 10 to 20 people, and it will look as though the whole world's against you. So don't do that. Do not respond to physical attacks and provocation, but film everything. Very obvious that, isn't it? People do that nowadays anyway, but it has to be done. Keep all court paperwork simple and to the point. If you're up against these people, keep the legal argument incredibly simple so the judge just knows. It's like what happened previously with the court case was that the lines were blurred as to whether these people had at one point been allowed to use the building. So I kept it very simple and said the trust requires immediate possession of trust property, and trespassers removed by order of the court. So once you defined them as trespassers, they had to prove that they weren't trespassing, and legally they were trespassing. Just keep it very, very simple. And as Saul Alinsky himself said, a drag is a drag. So do not get drawn into something that wears you out. And remember, they'll always do a major attack on Friday night just to ruin your weekend. So see it as a game plan that you are there to disrupt under their rules. Play by their rules back at them, because they're working in a very simple and restricted template, usually of political ideology framed as community. And that's exactly how the big players do it, isn't it? It doesn't matter whether it's a coup in a country or someone taking over your local community centre. The great thing about the communitarian agenda is the tactics are just the same. Simple. So do take a look at another article called Know the Enemy Within, and you'll get a good idea of how all this works. So thanks for listening to that. That was really for people who want to know this sort of information. I'll probably get some vacuous people unsubscribing after tonight's show, but the information is there for those who want and need it and will actually use it successfully. So hope that was useful. And next week, I will be back, same time, same place. If you want to support the show, please do. info@windowsontheworld.net, or you can support the show by going to the homepage. We are extremely marginalized, and I know there are a lot of people out there who appreciate this content. So thanks to everyone who keeps this going, because it's the people who listen who keep it going, and they give me the encouragement to talk about these issues and keep redefining what we are putting out. So thanks a lot, everybody. That's great. I'm going to have a look at the chat and see you all next week.